So today I'm here to do a spoiler-free series review covering the first 4 books in the Stormlight Archive series. It starts with The Way of Kings. Now this is going to be a why you should read or should you read this series video, so I'm not going to talk any spoilers here. There's going to be no major plot discussion. Instead, I will just give you the basic setup and more focus on my thoughts and reactions, talk about which readers I think will best enjoy this series. I recognize that probably a lot of you watching have already started the series or possibly caught up and are excitedly waiting for the 5th book, Winds and Truth, to come out in December. So if that sounds good, if you just want to talk about one of your favorite series, want to talk about your thoughts and impressions on it, love to have that discussion down in the comments. All that being said, let's get started. So this is a multi-point of view epic fantasy series that starts out, as I mentioned, with The Way of Kings. In the first book, we follow the story from 3 different perspectives, and the cast of characters does expand within the later books. I'm not going to talk about who those perspectives are later on because I do think it's a spoiler even to know which characters are safe in the later portion of the series. So I'll just mention that we start with 3 main perspectives, one being Kaladin, who at the beginning of the story is this great leader of this army. So we follow him, or specifically from the perspective of those that are following him, who believe him to be very lucky that anyone who travels with him is safe. And then we follow his perspective several months after those first events, and we get to see how his life has changed. We also get the perspective of Dalinar, who is a person of a noble birth, and then we also have this woman, Shaylin, and we follow their 3 perspectives as they eventually start to intertwine. Now this is one where, for me personally, I was immediately most invested in Kaladin. I think he is really presented to be somewhat of the protagonist, at least in the main focus of the first book. It felt like he got more screen time or page time in this case, and I think that his perspective is immediately likable. He is someone who at the beginning is positioned as someone who is lucky, but very much he is someone who in my mind fulfills the expression of someone who makes their own luck, where he really has worked hard and is in the position he is, and then when things change, you see him striving and pushing to try to make the best of the hand that he is being dealt. And I'm purposely being very vague about this because, again, I'd like to give away as little as possible, but I think he was really relatable. He's not perfect. You definitely see his flaws, and the book spells out very clearly what some of his motivations are, his past, and how the things that have really shaped his life affect the decisions he makes now, and why it is so important to him, or at least the beginning, to always be saving his men, to be saving those around him. And arguably he's painted to be very morally good. He's, again, goes for the straight and narrow, but I think he never felt like a stereotype to me. Again, you find enough of his small flaws. He just feels like a human in all the ways that really makes a character feel well-rounded. So I was immediately drawn to his perspective and most look forward to every time we return back to him. Then we also, as I mentioned, have the perspective of Dalinar. Now him, I found a character who I wasn't as immediately attached to. Again, he comes from a lot of privilege, and for me, he was the tipping point between where Kaladin was still a morally good character but felt flawed. Dalinar felt a little bit too perfect. He often spoke the proper truth of this is the correct way to do things, this is the way things should be done, and perhaps I recognize that that is written to be part of his character, that he sees everything very morally black and white and really aims to always achieve the correct response to any situation, but in that he becomes far less understandable or relatable, to me at least, because I always see humans as, again, very flawed. We make mistakes, and he seemed a little bit too perfect. Maybe it's a more reflection of myself, but I find characters that are too perfect tend to grate on me. So I didn't have the best first impression of him, but I still was interested, of course, in everything that was happening around his character. So certainly that perspective grew on me, and I could very much appreciate what the author was doing there and some of the development that does come through the books. And I want to be clear that he does progress as a character. I'm more talking first impressions, again, just to be careful here. And again, we also have Shaylin, who is a character that I feel like is written to be the immediately likable female character, which made me a bit wary of her. So she has 2 main, I'm going to say personality traits, but that's not quite correct. 2 distinct characteristics about her. She is someone who is very smart, and particularly book smart. She loves to read, and that is early established that she would spend her time growing up in the libraries, very much drawn to books, and then she also is someone who loves to draw. Now this actually brought an interesting perspective to the story. I'm sure if you followed any reviews that you're aware that the physical editions of these books include these beautiful illustrations, and the idea behind that is that it's actually her illustrations that we're often seeing on the pages. I really like that, especially for the sake of illustrations having a purpose to them and kind of seeing the story from her perspectives. The work itself is beautiful. I'm not artistic at all and very much can appreciate someone who is. So if you love illustrations in your adult fantasy, something I don't think a lot of us have seen in our books since we were children, but probably really enjoy. I thought they were always a great surprise, loved them, really took a minute to appreciate each page before I moved on, and I can't say anything but good things about the illustrations themselves. But what I found with the character is, as I mentioned, I was a bit wary of her, and it largely comes from the fact that she is immediately presented to be incredibly likable, and it almost felt like the author was going a little bit out of his way to write a female character that was, again, less flawed and kind of leaning into certain tropes or characteristics or personality quirks that their audience, the people reading this book, even if perhaps they're more drawn to, say, a male protagonist, are going to immediately like this young woman saying, oh, I'm a reader, or I love to draw, or I appreciate people who do draw, even if they're like me and can't draw at all. And so I was a little bit cautious. I felt again that she leaned a bit into perhaps being a Mary Sue. She was someone who very much was very depreciative of herself. She saw herself as someone who was smart but didn't necessarily value her womanly beauty, and leaned in again to appreciating her intellect and using that to progress the story. But I felt she was a bit of a simplistic character, at least where she starts, and while I liked her story to a degree, I still think that they started her out a little bit more simplistic than I would have liked. And at first I kind of felt like she was going to be the stereotypical female character. And all that being said, I should mention I've read several other series and books from Brandon Sanderson. I actually tend to like his female characterizations. I think I'm not alone in saying that I think he does it really well. And so I was surprised that this character just felt a little bit simple, and I would have loved her to be more flawed. If anything, I felt she was the one who I would have loved the author to play around with more, because I think it's a bit of a usual trope these days that we always want to write these strong female characters. And I personally think that the next step in progressing having female protagonists in our mainstream culture is making them really ugly and flawed the way that we are less shy to do so with our male characters. So anyway, I had those initial thoughts with the main characters. Again, keep in mind there are more perspectives that are introduced, but I'm going to leave it there. And again, I'm not going to comment on whether or not these original 3 characters continue on in the later books. And now I want to talk a little bit more about the story, again, without getting into any specific plot points, but rather discussing it as the work that it is. So I think a lot of you, again, are either watching this video having already read and ideally loved this series, or those of you like myself that have maybe started the series before and not continued, or someone who has never started, partially due to the intimidating length. Now, for backstory, I have previously read the first book that was several years ago, and I liked it but didn't love it. I was really bogged down by the bridge talk in this first book, and if you've read the series, you know what I'm talking about. There is a heavy angle to that. Within the story itself, there is a military component to it, and I just found the particular faction dealing with the bridges to be a very narrow focus that went on a really long time. As in, I expected it to be a couple sections, a couple character perspectives, and then the story would move along to something else and the characters would progress to something beyond bridges, and the bridge talk continued. And so I remember being very fatigued by that, expecting this series to be an all-time favorite, and ended up being a bit let down when I first read it. I gave it 3.5 stars. I appreciated it, but I didn't love it, and because of that, I didn't plan to continue on. However, again, that was many years ago. Since then, I've read a lot more fantasy, and so I thought, as I have changed in my own reading taste, I thought it'd be valuable to reapproach the series and see how it changes, and particularly seeing where it goes, because a lot of people consider the second book to be even stronger than the first, often the pinnacle of the series so far. And so rereading again, I was pleasantly surprised. Thankfully, the pieces really came together. Don't get me wrong, there is still a lot of bridge talk, but describing the story as being all about bridges was a really unfair criticism the first time around I read it. It's still a large component of the story, but it is a plot mechanism. There is a reason that they are doing these things. There is a purpose to that I don't want to discount and unfairly criticize the book for. But beyond the bridges, what really worked for me was the fact that we had these character perspectives. Again, I found myself more and more becoming a character-driven reader, and especially Kaladin was someone who I desperately wanted to know how he was going to move on from the situation he found himself in, and following his story. So despite the bridges, I kind of looked the other way and saw the greater picture. I wanted to see where the story was going, because you have generally at the beginning 3 characters that generally have their own motivations. You understand what they are aiming for, and you have that narrow focus, which for me really helps. Is I like a story where I understand where the plot is generally trying to go, or at least where the author is telling us that it's going. And then of course you have the larger story forming the entirety, which I believe there's going to be 10 books in the series once it's all complete. And so I found myself much more immersed in the story. It was gripping, and I read the first book and then went on to the second, third, and fourth. And I will say that it is a good, solid fantasy series. For my personal taste, I don't think the series will necessarily fall within my top 10, and instead this one is one that I would more so recommend to those that are getting into epic fantasy, because I think it ticks all the boxes. It follows the tropes of the fantasy genre. It does the things that you are looking for, the multiple perspectives, the big scope, but still the narrow perspective of the individuals that you are rooting for along the way as there is a larger thing happening. And so for me, if you were going to tell someone who's relatively, again, newer to the genre, I want to get into epic fantasy, give me a really good story, I personally would recommend this one. I do think that it really ticks those boxes. For me, if you look at my own personal favorites, I'm drawn to things that subvert the tropes and to do things that are a little bit different. While I think the characters are really strong, or particularly Kaladin starts out really strong, I feel the other characters at times were a bit flatter, as I mentioned, than I would have liked them to be. Certainly they grow, but to me, this book is one that's a little bit safe, and that can be, again, a great thing. It means that I can widely recommend it to a large audience. If you enjoy epic fantasy, you can easily say, try this out, I think you'll like it. I think it's pretty safe to put in anyone's hand. There's nothing really objectionable about it, but at the same time, because of the safety factor, it also means that the book itself is not taking as many risks and chances, and by playing it safe, it means it will appeal to most people, but also perhaps not be doing anything mind-boggling, mind-bending. Certainly, as you probably heard with Sanderson, he has what he calls the climax of his stories. I think it's a Sanderson avalanche or something. Someone correct me in the comments, where he really builds to an exciting conclusion, and certainly each of his books end with action and there's exciting intrigue and all of that. So again, it ticks all the right boxes. I honestly, other than some nitpicks about the characters, don't have any criticism. There was never a time where I was reading this thinking that doesn't make sense, that's a plot hole. Instead, it was just merely a matter of finding this series very good, but I don't entirely see from my own perspective why it is held above other series that I personally would put above it. For me, there are series, again, that live rent-free in my head with characters that I can't stop thinking about, that consume my attention and really capture me in a way that this series didn't quite get to those levels. Now, in terms of the writing, I thought this was solid. Of all the Brandon Sanderson books I've read, I would say that these are the best in terms of their prose. I saw a lot of nuance there. I could tell that he really spent some time figuring out how he wanted to present certain things, and there certainly were places in the story that I found myself underlining or highlighting and looking to remember and save those quotes. And so I think that this is some of the best. If you're someone who is more particular about your prose, this is where I would start with Brandon Sanderson, because I think it's going to give you the best luck of finding it. That being said, I do think he is a more simple writer. I don't think he is trying to be someone who is providing literary prose. Again, he serves the mass audience. He is the one who provides the stories that are consumed and gobbled up by the fantasy community. And so he is not looking to be a fringe author who will exclude anyone who does not have a preference for certain more elevated prose. Instead, what he's known for is writing great stories with likable characters. Of course, you have the magic system, which I haven't gotten into. And then you also have, again, these exciting stories that you can fly through that are highly consumable. And for the most part, again, are doing all the things right, which in a lot of times is all we're looking for as readers, is just a story that is not making a misstep, that is not tumbling over itself or jumping the shark, but instead providing the solid epic story that we're looking for. I also thought this one was well done in terms of world building. You have characters that are in different places within this world. There are some great maps that help to give the reader some understanding or anchoring of where things are taking place. And particularly, I love the world building around the world itself, where you have these epic storms that are happening that really have literally shaped the world and also shaped the culture and the characters and the communities around that. So I thought it was something I really enjoy. I tend to love storms in science fiction fantasy. I think it's something that I've definitely seen before, but I do not get tired of it. So really enjoy that aspect. I thought it was great where, again, you have the balance between these intimate character perspectives. And then the world itself felt vast. It feels like there's so much to explore, so much to come afterwards in the later books, and I'm very excited to see more of that. I want to know more about how the world works and have that, again, hopefully slowly unveiled to us as I continue on. Now, finally, you can't talk Brandon Sanderson without talking about his magic system, so I do want to mention that this one, once again, does include hard magic. However, compared to his other stories, say like Mistborn, the magic system itself is more woven into the story, so I found that by just simply reading the text, the details of how the magic worked, you kind of had to parse it out yourself, which is something I much more prefer now. When I first started reading fantasy, I much prefer things like Mistborn, where you literally have the character being told this is how the magic works. Instead, you get mentions of the glyphs and you slowly piece it all together, and certainly you get the characters saying a bit of it and talking about it a bit, but it's parsed out much more slowly, and you have to really be paying attention. If you're someone who really likes a hard magic system and want all the rules just laid out for you, know that there are appendices at the back of the book that do lay everything out. For me, that almost feels like giving away the sauce and kind of giving away too much. So I actually chose not to read that section because I would rather experience the understanding of the magic system more organically. But if you're someone who just says, tell me all the rules, they are there, they're just not in the actual text of the novel, which I personally appreciated as someone who has come to really enjoy the puzzling of that piece. So overall, I would absolutely recommend this one to anyone looking for a solidly written epic fantasy story. If you have not yet read it, I do recommend checking it out for yourself. If you've only read the first book and are uncertain, I will say, without getting into spoilers, that the books do build. You see the characters progress, the plot progresses, there are some good twists and turns of the plot, and again, you really have to follow it along. I don't yet see the full picture of all 10 books, and so I look forward to seeing as it goes. I do personally plan to continue on with this series. I would just tell people to be aware of the type of story that it is, that while it is doing everything very well, it is going to lean into the tropes that have become very popularized in the genre. If you are someone who loves the series even more than I do, I'd love to hear your comments down below, because I'm sure that even by having these quibbles in my video here, I'm sure I'm touching on some nerves. So again, no disrespect. If you love this series, I'd love to know why, and specifically, if it is your favorite, why is it your favorite? Because again, I think it's doing a lot of things right, but I really expected, after having read the later books, that there would be some great shift where this series would go from being good to great to amazing to my best all-time favorite series, and it definitely hasn't taken that space for me, but I know it has for you, so I want to know more about that down below. So I think that's it for this video here. I'd love to know your thoughts, good or bad. If you haven't read it or have, weigh in, and just make sure to keep this video spoiler free in the comments. So if you are going to talk spoilers, leave a ton of spaces. I don't want anyone spoiled if they're just checking out this video for the first time and have not yet started their journey. Love to know if you're planning on reading the 5th book as it comes out. I definitely want to, I just need to get my hands on it. So anyway, if you enjoyed this video, hopefully you give it a thumbs up, drop a comment, even if just an emoji. Represent the Stormlight archives, perhaps with some thunderclouds. And if you want to know more, I'd love to have you stick around, subscribe, hit that little notification bell, and I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.